For over 100 years, no outsider had ever set foot near this stretch of Amazon jungle. Governments assumed nobody could reach it, let alone survive there. Then a small government aircraft, not an army or a research team, flew low over the canopy near the Peru border. It found something nobody expected. In May 2008, Brazil's Indian Affairs Department, an agency called FUNAI, released a set of aerial photographs taken from a small plane flying over a remote patch of rainforest in Acre State, right on the border with Peru. The pictures showed a cluster of thatched huts in a jungle clearing. Around them stood warriors, their bodies painted deep red, bows pulled tight, arrows pointed up at the aircraft passing overhead. One figure appeared to be a woman, her body colored black, standing quietly while the men prepared to fire. The photographer was José Carlos dos Reis Meireles Jr., a FUNAI expert who had spent about 20 years tracking signs of this group without ever making contact with them. Meireles told reporters the flight was meant to prove something simple, that these people were real, that they were still out there, and that their land was under threat. FUNAI estimated at the time that as many as 68 uncontacted tribes might exist across Brazil, though only around 24 had been officially confirmed. News outlets around the world ran the pictures within hours. Survival International, a human rights group that campaigns for tribal peoples, released the images publicly and called them proof that a way of life most of humanity had lost centuries ago was still surviving, deep in the jungle. Stephen Corey, the group's director, said the world needed to protect this tribe's land before it vanished for good. The photos made headlines everywhere. But almost as fast as the story spread, a new question started forming behind the scenes, one that would follow this tribe for the next decade. Not everyone was convinced the photos meant what people assumed. A few weeks after the pictures went public, the British newspaper, The Observer, ran a piece questioning whether the tribe was really as unknown as headlines suggested, and whether flying a plane low enough to photograph them counted as a kind of contact all on its own. Meireles pushed back hard. He explained that people in the region had told stories about this group since as far back as 1910, and that he personally had known signs of their existence for 2 decades. Neither he nor FUNAI had ever claimed the tribe was a brand new discovery, he said. What made this moment different was documentation, not discovery. Nobody outside the government had ever seen clear proof before. Stephen Corey backed him up, pointing out that Survival International had never used the word lost to describe the group either. The tribe wasn't unknown to the people whose job was protecting them. It was unknown to everyone else, and that gap was exactly the problem FUNAI wanted to close. That argument settled down after a few weeks, but the tribe itself did not disappear from the news. 6 years later, something happened that no camera flying overhead could have captured, because this time, the tribe walked out of the jungle on their own. At the end of June 2014, a small group of people, most of them young, appeared near a village called Simpatia in Brazil's Acre State, close to the settled Ashaninka indigenous community there. The Ashaninka spotted them right away and reported it to the authorities. FUNAI sent out a team that included health workers, linguists, and specialists trained specifically for these kinds of first contact situations. This was the first sustained contact with an uncontacted group in that part of the Amazon in almost 20 years. A video camera captured part of the moment, showing an Ashaninka man calling out, "Zara, Zara," meaning, "Good, good," trying to signal to the newcomers that they meant no harm. In the footage, the visitors and the villagers can be seen exchanging small gifts like bananas. Funai later learned these people had walked for several days just to reach Simpatia, and that their home ground was actually across the border, inside Peru. They were treated for an acute respiratory infection, a serious risk for any isolated group with no immunity to outside diseases, and were kept in a kind of quarantine before eventually heading back toward the forest. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of that explained why they had left their home in the first place. The real answer came out through an interpreter, and it turned a story about first contact into a story about something far darker. Survival International worked with an interpreter named Z. Correa to translate what the visitors were saying, and what came through was brutal. According to Correa, the majority of the older people in their community had been massacred by non-Indians in Peru, attackers who shot at them with firearms and burned down their homes. The survivors said many elderly people died in the attack, and that 3 victims were buried together in a single grave because there wasn't time or safety enough to do more. Correa said the death toll was so high that the community couldn't bury everyone, and that some of the bodies were left exposed to vultures. Survival International's campaigns director at the time, a woman named Rebecca Watson, said the organization was extremely worried, not just about the risk of future attacks, but about the danger of disease spreading through the group now that they had entered contact. Nixiwaka Yawanawa, an indigenous man from Acre State who spoke publicly about the situation, said he felt sad watching relatives from an uncontacted group face what he called a threat of extermination, and criticized Peru for failing to take responsibility for what was happening on its side of the border. Reports like this raised an obvious question. If a group with almost no contact with the outside world was being hunted down with guns, who exactly was doing the shooting, and why? The suspected culprits weren't soldiers or settlers looking for land to farm. Investigators and advocacy groups pointed to illegal loggers and cocaine traffickers operating inside Peru's side of the border region, an area with dense jungle cover that makes it easy to move product and hard for authorities to patrol. Brazil and Peru had actually signed an agreement back in March 2014, just a few months before the Simpatia contact, promising to work together to protect the land belonging to isolated tribes in that border region. According to Survival International, the agreement did little to stop what was already happening on the ground. Stephen Corey said both governments had promised to shut down the illegal logging and drug trafficking, pushing uncontacted groups out of their territory, and that both had failed. He added that traffickers had reportedly taken over a government post that was supposed to monitor exactly this kind of activity. This wasn't an isolated case of one bad group of criminals stumbling into the wrong stretch of forest. It was part of a much bigger pattern that had been playing out across the region for years, one that would keep repeating itself, even after 2014. A few weeks after the Simpatia contact, more members of what appeared to be the same tribe emerged again, still fleeing the same violence back in Peru. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a slow, ongoing collapse of a community's home territory, forcing terrified people across an international border just to survive. The threat wasn't limited to this one group either. In 2017, a Brazilian federal prosecutor in Amazonas state opened an investigation into reports that gold miners had massacred at least 10 members of a different uncontacted tribe near the Jandiatuba River, close to Peru's border. At the same time, budget cuts had forced the closure of a FUNAI unit responsible for protecting indigenous land in that exact area, leaving the region even more exposed to invaders. Put together, these events painted a picture of isolated tribes across the Amazon border region being squeezed from every direction at once by loggers, miners, and traffickers, all chasing resources on land that technically belonged to people the modern world had barely glimpsed. That raised a deeper question about the agency meant to prevent exactly this kind of disaster in the first place. FUNAI's official policy is to avoid initiating contact with isolated tribes altogether. The agency instead maintains a contingency plan for situations where a group decides to make contact on its own terms, which is exactly what happened at Simpatia in 2014. FUNAI has tracked at least 4 distinct isolated tribes in that particular border region for more than 20 years without ever approaching them directly. The reasoning comes down to 2 things: disease and disruption. Isolated groups have no built-up immunity to common illnesses, like the flu or malaria, meaning something as small as a cold virus carried in by an outsider can spread through an entire community and kill a large share of its people within weeks. On top of that, forcing contact strips away a group's ability to choose their own future, something international law and most modern anthropologists treat as a basic right for indigenous communities. FUNAI's expert Morales put it simply when describing the tribe's reaction to his own overflights years earlier. He said the arrows fired at his aircraft weren't really acts of aggression at all, but messages. Essentially, a way of saying, "Leave us in peace, do not disturb." That single interpretation reframes the entire story, turning what looks like an attack in a photograph into something closer to a plea. Whether that plea will actually be honored going forward is still an open question, and it connects to a much bigger number that puts this single tribe story into a wider perspective. Survival International has estimated that roughly 100 uncontacted tribes exist around the world, with the large majority living somewhere in the Amazon rainforest, split mostly between Brazil and Peru. FUNAI itself has referenced around 69 to 77 possible isolated groups just within Brazil's borders, though only a portion of those have been officially confirmed through direct evidence like sightings, photographs, or physical traces, such as abandoned camps. Every one of these groups faces some version of the same threats that hit the Simpatia tribe in 2014. Illegal logging clears the forest they depend on for food and shelter. Drug trafficking routes cut straight through territory that used to be untouched. Oil, gas, and mining operations push deeper into remote areas every year, chasing resources that sit beneath land nobody in a boardroom has ever actually walked. None of these pressures are new, and none of them show signs of slowing down. That leaves every isolated tribe still living in the Amazon sitting in roughly the same position the Simpatia group was in back in June 2014. Except most of them have never had a moment where the world was actually watching. A tribe that had avoided nearly all outside contact for generations was pushed out of its own home by armed men chasing profit. And the only reason anyone outside the jungle ever heard about it was a video camera, an interpreter, and an advocacy group willing to publish what a handful of terrified young people had to say. The photographs from 2008 proved this way of life was real. The events of 2014 proved just how fragile that life actually is. Nothing about this story ended in some kind of victory. The tribe that walked into Simpatia wasn't rescued in any lasting sense. They were treated for infection, questioned through an interpreter, and eventually returned to a forest that was still under threat from the same traffickers and loggers who had driven them out in the first place. The agreement between Brazil and Peru, meant to protect groups like theirs, had already failed by the time anyone signed it. What's left is a pattern that keeps repeating across the same stretch of border, year after year, group after group, largely out of sight of anyone who isn't already looking for it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.